happy to have a conversation about the food industry. It's actually, I had to kind of resurrect this because I haven't talked about this in a while, but people persuaded me to do that, so it was kind of fun to get back into it and think about it. So, okay, let's see if this thing... Okay, so all good academics, when they get money from the dark side, make sure that they disclose that receipt of funding. So I'm going to start with the disclosure here. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about was learned through a series of workshops called Building Trust to Address the Obesity Epidemic. And that started when I was a scientific director for CIHR, and then continued because people were quite keen to have this cross-sector dialogue about working with the food industry. So, but let me, as the disclosure slide points out, it wasn't just the food industry that was involved in this. And in fact, if we go to the next slide, this is a rough pie chart of the relative contributions of different sectors to the work that we did over a series of 3 meetings. So although the private sector was a little bit larger, non-governmental organizations and even government were significant contributors to the dialogue. So better start with a poll, because I don't know many of you, and I see that more people have entered the room. So we're going to do a little show of hands regarding whether you think the food industry is friend or foe or some combination of the above. So how many people think the food industry is a friend? Uh-oh. You're just going to be provocative. Is that it, Alan? Okay. How many think of the food industry as a foe? Ah, come on, you chicken. You really believe it is. Come on. An estranged partner. Okay. And how many? Some combination of the above. Okay, well, that sounds like waffling to me, but... Okay, actually, you're probably correct. All right, so I see that there's only a few people who would perceive the food industry as a friend. So I also, as an academic, am used to giving my key messages up front. It's late. You may want to have a rest while I'm giving the rest of the talk. So this is the set of take-home messages here. The first one is that the complexity of prevention means we need to have thoughtful lines in the sand. And so I don't think this is a black or white issue. I think there are many lines that need to be thought carefully about. The second point is that sometimes conflicts of interests are actually about convergence of interest. And understanding that distinction and thinking about how we manage that is pretty important. And lastly, slinging rocks and arrows, which we do all the time in this business, particularly when it comes to obesity and thinking about the food industry, just creates more silos, and it doesn't help us create safe spaces, at the very least, for conversation. So those are the 3 take-home messages I'm going to try to walk us through. So let's talk about the first one. Complexity of prevention means we need thoughtful lines in the sand. And some of you heard me speak yesterday about solutions to complex problems. A little bit of this will be repetition, but the argument for why we need to think about working with the food industry comes from this thing. So many of you will have seen this picture probably too many times, and if you work in the area of obesity, you know this as the UK Foresight program's Obesity Systems Map. I like this picture a lot because what it does, the dominant theme in this picture is the interconnectivity, not the individual variables that are interconnected, but the lines that connect them. And we often don't think about those things. We think about the individual points. And I won't show you the picture of the US healthcare system I showed yesterday that aligns everything. So I think that's a really important point. Now, we did a little bit of work a few years ago where we, if you will, zoomed out on this picture. So what we did is we constructed another version of the map, which highlights the different segments in the map. So these are the different areas and domains in the map. And we've connected them by lines that where the thickness is proportional to the number of underlying connections between those 2 regions in the direction that it's going. So it's not really about impact. Don't over-interpret the exercise that we did, but it illustrates how the people who constructed the map were thinking about the variables that were relevant. And there's one really interesting observation that I think is relevant to today's conversation in this map. The thickest line on this map goes from food production to food consumption. So the people who were involved, and this was mostly a stakeholder engagement process. It wasn't necessarily a good evidence synthesis or something like that. It was stakeholder engagement. Thought that food production really dominated in terms of what we eat. There's another interesting observation that goes with it, though. There's no return arrow. So the people involved in constructing this map didn't think that food consumption affected food production. And I'm sorry, if you work in the food industry, that clearly you'll know that's not true. But even those of you who work in health promotion know that what the food supply looks like is at least partly influenced by what people eat. And I'll give you an example. So let's think about salt and sodium reduction. In Canada and the US, I'm not sure what's going on here in Australia, Campbell's Soup Company has been a fair leader in that domain to try to reduce sodium in their soups. And in fact, as this article points out, they're having to add salt back to some of their soups because people stopped eating it. Salt affects taste. Taste affects purchase. Purchase affects what these guys produce. And so some of the highly critical people in our environment, a guy named Yanni Friedhoff, who's kind of really argues that we should never make a friend of the food industry, was critical of Campbell's for doing this. But think about it. If they're a food company, yes, profit's important. They're trying to do the right thing, reduce sodium, but people stop buying the product. So have they really actually accomplished what they're trying to do? No, and they're not making any money. And this is the place where if you're in dialogue with the food industry, you start to understand some of the inside issues that are important. So it was pointed out to me by somebody in the food industry who I'd built some trust with and was working with, that in fact, this is a place where the food industry would prefer that there was regulation. Why? Because if there's regulation about the content of sodium, then everybody's on the same playing field and everybody's product tastes a little bit worse, and then people will get used to it, right? So, but it's a very important thing, or people will just go home and add salt to the product. I mean, that's another thing that we can't necessarily control. So it's I learned an important lesson because I built enough trust with somebody who works in the food industry to understand that nuance about how we think about legislation and how they think about it. Difficult for them to say that quite publicly, but it's clear that that's an important issue. So for me, when I look at that big spaghetti map of the foresight diagram, I think of complexity and interdependency, but it's not the only attribute that's important for a complex system. There are many attributes that make a system complex as different from simple or complicated. Another one that I think is quite important in the dialogue we're having today is this idea of heterogeneity. Well, in the media, in many people's discourse, we talk about big food like it's a single entity. But it is far from a single entity and far from having a single product. There are many, and this is just packaged food products. It's not even speaking to fast food companies, but it's a vast enterprise, and they're not all created equal. And we really need to start nuancing our dialogue about food, because with tobacco, it was easy to talk about big tobacco. We don't need to smoke. It's not good for life, but we do need to eat, and we wouldn't want our food system to just crumble and go away. That would not be healthy. Many people would die from lack of access to food. So it's important that we transform our food system, and it's just not a simple matter, partly because of this heterogeneity. We do need more of this kind of activity where we actually try to nuance and understand the distinctions between food companies. So as I was putting together my talk, I came across this nice scorecard which illustrates that not only is this about what they sell, but it's also about their treatment of the land, it's about how they treat farmers, and many other parameters are important when we want to assess whether we have a healthy food system, and not all players are created equal. So let's nuance it and think more carefully about the distinctions. There's lots of heterogeneity. So again, the prevention system is kind of messy and complex, and there's lots of different interdependencies. And the usual response when we say a problem is complex and we accept that it's complex, that's usually my starting place. But the usual response is retreat, despair, believing the problem's beyond hope, assigning blame, simple solutions, or occasionally we galvanize our collective efforts and invest significant resources, as the NHMRC has, for example, in prevention, despite the fact that government has then de-invested in prevention. I get that that's a big challenge here in Australia right now. But, you know, it is, and I go through these emotions kind of on a daily basis when I'm dealing with a complex problem, because it is pretty easy to despair when you look at that picture of all the companies and think, how are we actually going to make change? But it is possible, and it is true that we can't think in terms of simple solutions, but maybe we can think in terms of some simple ideas. When you unpack them, they may be quite complex to actually implement, but there are some simple ideas, and I've been collecting a list of them for quite some time now, and unfortunately we don't have time to go through this list tonight. If you're interested, they videotaped my talk from yesterday, and I think the center will make that possible to see. So in that talk yesterday, I actually went through each of these and tried to illustrate the point on the slide, but many of them are actually relatively simple, like the idea of matching capacity and complexity. And I don't have time to talk about it a lot, but it really speaks to enabling individuals to make decisions in their own area, in their own remit, that they have the capacity to make. And this is an important component. But for today, we'll go over to this networks and teams idea and the idea of building authentic trust. And let me give you a little bit of language to go with it. So the issues, as I'm trying to say now, are not black and white. There's some shades of gray. And the language I want to give you is in particular around trust, because trust is not just one simple thing. You either trust somebody or you don't. There's blind trust, there's simple trust, there's authentic trust, and then at the other end of the spectrum there's cordial hypocrisy. And there's a hell of a lot of cordial hypocrisy when it comes to talking with the food industry. So let's talk about it. Simple trust is the trust we take for granted. It's devoid of suspicion, can't be recovered if it's lost. So I trusted that the itinerary would work and everybody would be nice to me when I came to Australia, and so far I'm in pretty good shape. Blind trust is when you actually are exposed to some sort of violation or betrayal, but you deceive yourself and continue to trust. And that's a kind of a complex thing. We won't talk too much about that today. But cordial hypocrisy, there's tons of this, particularly when we talk about the food industry and obesity, where there's just a facade of goodwill and congeniality that hides real distrust and cynicism. And that's destructive to teamwork. It actually makes things more complex if you live in a world where there's lots of cordial hypocrisy. And then there's authentic trust, and that's the kind of trust that we need to continue to foster and build, because it can't be taken for granted. It needs to be carefully considered, and it must be, you know, continuously cultivated. And I think when it comes to an area like obesity and the food industry, we really have to work at this, because it's very easy for the industry to make us feel like our trust has been betrayed in the individuals that we might be engaging with. Because remember, big, huge multinationals, no individual in those kinds of companies can control everything that a company might actually do. So when they come out with some egregious marketing, but you've just worked with an individual from that company to learn and create opportunity, it's very difficult to withstand that. Trust is important because it helps reduce complexity. And if we're in an environment where there's high trust, we're able to form these wide-reaching partnerships and cooperative relationships. But in a low-trust society, it's kind of an economic disaster area, or in this case, a prevention disaster area potentially, because we cut off a whole arm of what we might be able to do. And we talked a little bit about that today, the idea of thinking about the delivery mechanisms that big food has may be important to how we deliver healthy food as well, and they may be, you know, there may be opportunities to work together. So there are some other challenging lines in the sand. We won't talk a lot about it, but things like, you know, science and academic knowledge, you know, we put huge value in things like meta-analysis and RCTs. But then there's the tacit knowledge of practice-based evidence, and then there's the science-ploitation, if you will, which is sometimes I think people worry about it as it relates to big food, because we take what the nutrition professionals have provided us about what's healthy, this ingredient, and then it gets turned into marketing. So again, not simple black and white issues, but significant nuance that needs to be thought about. And even when it comes to thinking about how we get good advice, while we think advice from a clinical professional is really valuable, health promotion might not necessarily be as evidence-based, but then what about food marketing? These are all on a continuum, and we need to think about that continuum. So I think the complexity of prevention means we can't think about it as black and white. We need to think about those lines in the sand more thoughtfully. What about conflicts of interest and convergence of interest? What do I mean by that? And the case against collaboration suggests that there's always a conflict of interest when we think about the food industry. So those who really think we should stay away from partnering with the food industry talk about the fact that the only interest of the private sector is profit. But as the president of Kellogg's Canada said to me one day, you know, I have a 10-year-old child as well, and I don't want my child to be obese. So, you know, human beings work in these companies, and there is nuance to be thought about there. Private sector partnerships with health organizations is only about buying credibility, positive emotions, health washing, as some people will call it. I'm not sure that's the case necessarily either. You could imagine that maybe they also want to transform their food portfolio and need the help of others to help get people to eat the products so that they can remain profitable even if they're delivering healthier food. The risk of partnering with the food industry outweighs any potential benefits, as some would argue, because of the health washing. And regulation and legislation are the only way to obtain the necessary changes. I think there are times when pledges by food companies to make change can be helpful, but also times when legislation can be helpful. We need to be thoughtful about that. So I'll tell the short story that goes behind how Adrian and I work together. And it's a short story in my mind of convergence. So we found out that Kellogg's, in this case, was going to put more than 1 million pedometers in boxes of Special K. Special K being a health associated. I don't want to get into an argument about whether it is a healthy product, but it certainly has a health halo to it based on the way it's sold. And 1 million pedometers in Canada, country of 30 million, that's a fair number of pedometers. That's a big natural experiment. And so we had the notion that maybe we could understand whether this marketing campaign, not health promotion campaign, but this marketing campaign actually had an impact on health. So we identified it as a natural experiment with the potential to impact health, knowledge, awareness, and behavior. And then we created behind the scenes, there's a lot that happened between these two boxes, but we actually created a place where Canadians could donate their steps to health research. And we actually got the CIHR logo on the back of a cereal box, which I have to tell you was an interesting feat. We had to get sign-off from 9 government departments during a blackout in Ontario, a 3-week sort of period where the energy grid was down. It was quite an interesting experience. But I had colleagues behind me who were quite enthusiastic about the possibilities. And that led to a whole supplement to the Canadian Journal of Public Health of research on this natural experiment. And so that's, I think, a unique kind of way to think about this. So there we go, CIHR logo on the back of a cereal box where people are invited to walk, log on, and donate their steps to health research. And the interesting part of the story is that we had to get to the agreement to do this, and then we called the researchers to the table to help us figure out how we were going to learn from this exercise. And so in a very short period of time, we assembled a group of researchers. It was actually a competitive process to participate in this project, and they had to also say that they were available on a particular date to come, or set of dates, to come to a meeting and figure out what the research was. And Adrian actually was part of that exercise. So we made it global, and it was mostly Canadians, but we had a few outsiders who were good contributors to this project and helped us through that. And so here's some of the data that I think is the most compelling from this project. Because of the work of Adrian and colleagues in the Canadian Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute, we actually had independent data from a physical activity monitor that they were delivering on a regular basis that told, and we actually got data before the pedometers went in the boxes of cereal, in which we asked the question, do you have a pedometer, and if so, where did it come from? So before, of course, nobody got their pedometer pedometer out of a box of cereal. By the end of a year of giving out pedometers in boxes of cereal, more people who had pedometers got it from a box of cereal than had purchased it. So that speaks to the impact of giving out 1 million pedometers. Actually, they did it twice, so I think they ended up giving out about 2 million pedometers by the end. It was such a successful sales marketing campaign. And in fact, you couldn't find the initial boxes that went on the shelf. There's lots of complex stories behind it, and you can read some of that in the supplement. But this is the data that suggests that if you do something like this, and then you, in your monitor, ask people whether they remember or are aware of the tagline, "Donate your steps to health research," and they owned a pedometer, they did in fact have a greater odds ratio of actually being physically active in the week before. Self-report, there's lots of issues with it, but nonetheless, this is a message to me that you can have, that sales marketing can have a huge impact. And it's important for us to try to understand this, and it's a way in which we might actually be able to see a convergence of interest to working with the food industry. Just a couple of other quick stories about convergence of interest. I told a few people this story. So Kraft Dinner is a very popular, probably one of the most widely eaten packaged food meals globally. So I don't know whether somebody said you don't have it here, but it is a very, very well-distributed packaged food. And the story, I don't have the picture of the right boxes, but the story I heard from a vice president from Kraft, who I built some trust with and we had worked with, was around when they developed a low-sodium version of Kraft Dinner and marketed it with that same box, only it said low sodium on it. It was a disaster. It didn't sell, nobody bought it, nobody cared, it didn't matter. So they repackaged it, didn't change the formulation, same sodium reduction, and called it Hint of Salt. And it sold great. So what does that say? Well, for me, it says that people in the food industry, and we kind of know this, but we tend to ignore it, are very good at understanding marketing and marketing influences, or they learn from their own mistakes. And again, it's a place where health promotion researchers and practitioners don't necessarily understand this at the depth that people in food marketing do. And if we built trust and enabled conversations at the very least, we might learn from each other in ways that are quite valuable. One more story. So in the US, a group of 16 large food companies came together to commit to taking, what did they say, they committed to taking 1 trillion calories, I think, out of the food supply. And after 5 years, they actually removed 6.4 trillion calories from the marketplace, so 400% over their goal. They created a new coalition of diverse organizations. So this was all private sector companies coming together. And I'll tell you later that they don't always work well together. So this is an important piece. And they also turned money into grants and prizes for schools and things like that. So sounds good. Most people are quite skeptical of self-pledges, but the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the US commissioned an independent evaluation of this exercise, and on the right you can see that they confirmed that there were 6.4 trillion fewer calories, about a reduction of about 10.6% from between 2007 and 2012. And they even went as far as doing the calculation and saying that this caloric sales reduction decreased the calories going out by 78 kilocalories per capita per day. Now, it's a little harder to figure out whether that reduced the kilocalories coming into homes. So you can prove that it stopped going out by these companies. And they did do a study. Needless to say, I don't really understand the methodology, but the methodology where they looked at the reductions in what came into homes suggests, well, there's some compensation by purchasing calories from other companies. So in essence, it sort of argues food companies can do a lot on their own if they're committed, but we may also need legislation to help reduce it system-wide. Could convergence improve the quality of industry-supported health promotion? One last story. So in Canada in 2012, Coca-Cola had the rights to the 2010 torch relay. And they wanted to do some sort of health promotion activity attached to the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, which was occurring in Vancouver. And so they partnered with Participaction in order to deliver what they called the So Go Active program. Now, we mostly assume that Coca-Cola did that to health wash their brand. But isn't it possible that they did it because they don't have the expertise in evidence-based health promotion, and they wanted to work with an organization that could help them deliver a program that was more likely to be effective and they could evaluate it than they just wanted to health wash their activity? It's possible. I don't think we'll ever know the full story behind this, but Participaction got slammed in the media for actually working with Coca-Cola. And what was also interesting is when you first looked at the website that they produced, for the first time, I saw Coca-Cola in black and white, and Coca-Cola adheres to its brand quite strongly. But in the initial stages of this activity, Coca-Cola was actually in black and white on one side, Participaction on the other side of the website. So just open your mind to the possibility that the food industry may actually have motives that are not unreasonable. But not all convergence is a good idea. Fundamentally, you know, the notion of pink buckets of chicken, really, I find that pretty tough. And this, not surprisingly, was a donation for breast cancer and breast cancer awareness, but somehow it just doesn't play well. So we have to think about these relationships at multiple levels. There are many different types of potential convergence or relationships between the food industry and government and other players. They range from very simple donations, charitable, financial, or in-kind. And often when you talk to academics, that's what they want. I need the money to be able to do what I want to do. We have an impoverished prevention system, so they're always looking for money. But that's the wrong way to go and have a dialogue with the food industry. There can be platforms for discussion like the Building Trust work, all the way from sponsorships, alliances, and partnerships. And this diagram and the discussion paper it comes from, and not surprisingly, there's a lower level of complexity on the left and higher on the right. This paper was written by or commissioned by government, so the Director General of the Office of Nutrition Policy and Promotion at Health Canada, who used to work for me and worked for me behind the scenes on the Building Trust initiative. And he built trust with people in the private sector through that exercise and went as far as being able to have this discussion paper. And many governments wouldn't go this far to talk about why we might want to partner with the private sector. So conflicts of interest can also be convergence of interest. So again, I don't think it's a black and white issue and we need to think about it. And my last sort of key message is around the fact that we do sling rocks and arrows all the time in the media. We do claim that it's a black and white issue. And this makes it difficult for our silos to come together in some sort of safe space dialogue. I've already given you the story around Participaction. And there's tons of this out there, this kind of, allegation that your children don't care about, healthy fruits and vegetables because these corporations brainwash them. Well, it's just not that simple, is it? And there are many reasons why kids may not eat healthy fruits and vegetables. Even as simple as not necessarily introducing them into, to vegetables early enough in life that they get over the bitter taste. I mean, there's science around that. So there's lots of different reasons, and this kind of allegation is not very helpful. So instead we have silos, mostly between academics, healthcare professionals, NGOs, and the private sector. And I don't think these silos are particularly helpful. So we did a little exercise at an obesity conference in a workshop where we just asked we had each of these silos sitting at their own tables, so healthcare professionals sitting at their own table separate from academics, and we asked them to articulate what were their deeply held beliefs about food messaging. So not surprisingly, the academics felt that food messaging requires evidence. Science has the answer. But, how helpful is the food messaging around individual nutrients that has a science base to it when it comes to figuring out what to eat? The academics believe knowledge equals behavior change, or at least that's what the ones at this conference said. Industry makes messages confusing and consumers just give up. So this is the kind of deeply held beliefs from that sector. Health professionals are fairly similar in that they say you can demonstrate causality, so they believe it's simple enough to sort this out, and therefore we should only have food messaging that is appropriate. We need to provide healthy eating guidelines, and there's lots of controversy even about our food guidelines in Canada. And food messaging is an unwanted nuisance, is the way it is, except that we do it, different sectors do it. NGOs believe that educated consumers make healthier choices, uneducated consumers need healthy defaults, and industry is part of the problem and potentially part of the solution, so there's some give there. And the private sector, interestingly enough, says things like, educated choice is a positive step. So actually the food industry would like appropriate education, or at least the people around the table felt that that was important. They believe that bans on certain kinds of foods don't work, and I think they're right, and I think consumption shows that to some extent, so just outright banning of something. I'm not suggesting that there aren't things that we can do to reduce sugar-sweetened beverage intake, things like that, but outright bans in their mind don't work. And as they point out, industry knows best how to communicate and educate. Well, that's their deeply held belief about food messaging, but there's an element of truth in most of these things. Not 100% truth, but elements of truth, and we need to kind of think more deeply about it. We did some work with the Building Trust participants, so we had roughly a quarter of the participants from each of those sectors in this series of workshops that we did. And we actually constructed a concept map where we asked people to speak about the barriers or to write down the barriers to building trust. And then a concept map has a nice statistical methodology behind it where things then get clustered. You sort them and you get clusters. And so these are the different areas that were barriers to building trust: self-interest and fear, non-constructive criticism, stereotypes and misrepresentations, system barriers, competing conflicts, things of that sort. We also asked them to talk about what might be the strategies for building authentic trust. And it was things like partnership enabling behavior, honest interactive communication, i.e. not cordial hypocrisy, reciprocal knowledge, roles and clarifications, etc. So there are things that we can do that enable more constructive dialogue. And I learned a few interesting things. I brought a few of them here for you because I think it's worth thinking about it. So trust building to address obesity really does need some kind of safe space, particularly when the outer world is always talking about it in a very black and white term. Regulation, as I told you earlier, is needed when competition is undesirable, and regulation levels the playing field. And this, I learned this from somebody who works in the food industry. And also kind of surprising is that within sector trust is actually much more difficult to build than between sector trust. So it's actually harder to build trust within the private sector for working together, or within the academic sector for working together, or within government even for working together, and NGOs who are competing. So within each of these sectors, we compete with each other within the sector. Academics compete with other academics for research money and for publications. NGOs compete with each other for donor dollars. The private sector obviously competes for market share. So that actually makes the barriers even harder within a sector. The benefits of having safe spaces for discussion is a very starting place, is an early starting place, is that they can be a catalyst for new collaborations. They can deepen our understanding of each other just so that we understand where they're coming from instead of just having unsubstantiated, deeply held beliefs about the stereotype that we want to apply. They can be innovation incubators and think tanks for new ideas. And our Director General in the Office of Nutrition Policy and Promotion had a very extensive education campaign in partnership with the Food and Consumer Products of Canada. And both of the parties in that exercise will tell you, and have told me on numerous occasions, that there was no way they would ever made it through the sticky bits of getting that nutrition education campaign out if they hadn't built a relationship before they actually started to try to work together. So it could be a nurturing substrate and an opportunity to celebrate and communicate successes. Some of the risks are changes in leadership, and that's true in many places, particularly with government, because government has a tendency to have more turnover in it, but it's private sector as well. Our stereotypes and assumptions about the motivations of others get in the way. Betrayal by others in organizations or sectors. So this is a really important problem. We complain about big food because they do something egregious like pink buckets of chicken or other kinds of egregious things. But those companies, those international companies, are very large. And even if you build a good relationship with the VP for nutrition, it doesn't mean that he controls what happens in marketing. So we have to be able to deal with and live with that kind of sense of betrayal. I was invited to meet with Indra Nooyi, who's the CEO of PepsiCo, and they were telling us all about what they're trying to do to change their portfolio to increase the more healthy products. But as one of her senior staff said, as much as we work hard to deliver healthier products so that people have those choices, we're not getting rid of Red Bull anytime soon because frankly, it's just too profitable. So we have to learn to live with some of that. We're not going to necessarily change that unless we change it over time and we change what we consume and want to buy. And lastly, media influences. The whole relationship between participation and Coca-Cola just blew up in the media in such a way that it became impossible for those partners to work together. So again, these are my key messages, and I have 2 more slides that I'll leave you with, and they're not specific to public-private partnership, but they're actually criteria for successful cross-sector partnership. And this could be between government and NGOs, government and academic institutions, etc. So these are practical things to think about if you think about building a partnership. So I think good advice to the Prevention Center, even if it doesn't include the private sector now. So it's important to always think about these parameters: aligning strategy, mission, and values, personal connections and relationships. Leaders on either side need to be able to come together to work, to build trust and mutual respect. Good governance practices are really important, both in the planning, execution, and completion of a project. Representation, transparency, and accountability, thinking about what that accountability mechanism is going to be like up front. Acknowledging and respecting partners having divergent interests and trying to work within that frame. Commitment of resources for carrying out partnerships, strong project management with clear expectations, outcomes, benefits, expectation management, vertical rather than horizontal relationships where there's equal power, and built-in processes for review and evaluation. All of these are metrics, and if you're interested, we put them together. There's going to be a review on cross-sector partnerships in the annual reviews of public health coming out in March 2015, and I could probably share a preprint if people are interested. But there is a literature in this area. It does speak to these kinds of attributes for successful partnership, and I think these kinds of attributes can be applied when we think about the food industry. So I don't have any more slides, but I thought I would close by doing the poll again. So how many people think the food industry is a friend? Oh, we still have 1 volunteer. He's just trying to cause trouble over there. How many think they're a foe? So I haven't changed anybody's mind. So the rest of you think it's somewhere in between. So thank you for your attention.